we're going to move on to talking about our auditory system. Now, before we get too far into stuff, I want to point out that the order that I cover our senses is a little bit different from the order that the textbook uses. Specifically, I believe I talk about vision far later than the textbook does. But I do that because our auditory system and our visual system are kind of a nice parallel to each other. We will cover the information, just not in the same order, and that's fine. Now, for each of our senses, instead of starting with a straight definition, we're going to start mostly with talking about what stimulus each system is using. So in the case of our auditory system, our sense of hearing, our stimulus is sound, and specifically sound waves. So sound waves are vibrations of molecules that are traveling through a medium. In most cases, that medium is air. So when we hear a sound, we're picking up on vibrating air molecules, and they're vibrating in a particular pattern that allows us to tell what sound they're associated with. So another medium that we can hear sound in would be water. And you'll notice that when you're swimming, you're going to hear things just a little bit differently. Everybody sounds a little bit deeper. Maybe their speech is distorted if you're hearing people talking outside of the water. And that's because water has this movement of molecules in a much different pattern than air does. So you can still hear sounds because we're still getting vibrations in molecules traveling through a medium, but the medium has some different properties. And no matter what medium these sound waves are traveling through, the vibrations travel at a fraction of the speed of light. So they're not traveling very, very quickly. They're traveling at the speed of sound. So that's good to note when we're comparing it to things like light as a stimulus. Now, for our sound waves, we can describe a couple of different characteristics of these waves. And these characteristics are amplitude, frequency, wavelength, and purity. And a lot of these concepts are going to also apply when we start talking about light and our visual sensations. So it's a good idea to learn them here because we're going to talk about them in a lot of cases. So our wavelength being the distance, the length between the different peaks in our waves. So from the top of one wave to the top of the next is our wavelength. Our amplitude is how far or how high these waves deviate from our center line. And we're going to talk about each of these independently, but we have these associations. So our amplitude, this deviation from center, is associated with loudness. Our frequency, which is closely related to our wavelength, is associated with pitch. And then purity is actually kind of the shape of these lines. And that's going to give us our timbre or our quality of tone. And so we can look at examples for each of these, and then at the end, there's another video because it's a lot easier to talk about sound waves when someone's playing those actual sounds at you. So first off, we have frequency. So if sounds are described by frequency, we're talking about their cycles per second in most cases, which could also be called hertz. And so frequency is used pretty much interchangeably with pitch. So if we talk about something being high frequency or high pitch, then it's higher in pitch. So we would see something like this, which would make a sort of sound. Whereas if we have a lower frequency or a lower pitch, we'd have more of a And again, there's a video with real sounds, so it's not just me making sounds at a microphone. But that's what we're talking about when we're talking about frequency and pitch. And so for this idea of cycles per second, When I say it's related to our wavelengths, we can remember that our wavelength is the distance between the two peaks here. Whereas frequency, instead of looking at specifically the wavelength, so instead of calling this meters or some kind of length, we could change our scale a little bit. And what if we called this axis time? What if this was seconds? Because our measurement is cycles per second. So we can have say that this is 1 second is the whole graph here. We'd have 1, 2, 3, 4 cycles in a second. So this would be 4 hertz. Whereas if we say that this guy has the same axis, this is still going to be 1 second. This is only 2 cycles in a second. So this one would be 2 hertz. So this is lower frequency, and this is higher frequency. And I won't ask you to calculate frequencies or anything like that. You won't even have to recognize the graphs. I just find it's a much easier way to visualize these concepts. So if we move over to wavelength, we've already kind of talked about that, where we would treat this axis as a length, a physical length, instead of a time. But our wavelength is going to measure the distance in the physical world between those two peaks. And you can imagine if sound waves are traveling at a consistent rate, having more cycles per second is also going to mean that you have a shorter wavelength, which is why I talk about wavelength and frequency as both being very closely related and both being directly related to our pitch. So if you ever see a graph that has sort of a distance here and an amplitude here, then we're talking about wavelengths, whereas if it's an amplitude and a time, it's going to be frequency, but both are giving us the same basic information. So this one is still going to be higher frequency because it has a shorter wavelength. And this one is a lower frequency because it has a longer wavelength. It's just about how you frame the graphs. The a little bit easier, at least in my mind, concept to talk about is amplitude. So if we talk about the amplitude of our waves, we're talking about how much energy is contained within that wave. So more energy is higher amplitude, is louder sounds. And this is usually measured in decibels. And so when we're looking at amplitude, we're caring about how far you're going away from this central point. So everything is oscillating or waving around this midpoint, this sort of neutral line. And so our amplitude is how far away that peak gets from our neutral point. So more energy means that you're pushing the air molecules further away from their resting point. So more energy to push them farther means higher amplitude and more loud. Whereas this one would be a lower amplitude, so less energy, less pushing away, and a quieter sound. That one's a little bit easier, I think, to conceptualize. And now our last quality is purity. And purity is a little bit of an abstract one. So purity is viewed not so much as something that we can concretely measure, but something that we can look at in terms of the sound envelope. And sound envelope is a fancy way of saying what shape are the waves that we're looking at. And so when we talk about timbre being related to purity, we're basically asking what is the quality of the sound that we're hearing. So all of these examples here have been pure tones. So something kind of like a tuning fork, where you see these nice clean oscillations, these nice clean waves with no weird stuff going on. So that's a pure tone. If we had something like a flute isn't quite pure, but it's close. So we're still going to see these repeating waves, but now we have these weird shapes on top. So that's changing the sound envelope, that's changing the shape of the waves, and it changes the quality of the sound that we're hearing. And then the human voice takes it even further, and those sounds go all over the place. We're still seeing predictable repeating waves, but they're a lot messier. So they're less pure. The quality is very different, especially compared to a tone like a tuning fork. Now, like I said, all of these different qualities are summed up very nicely in this YouTube video, also put on our e-class. So if you want, you can pause the video, watch that, and it just shows with visuals and with really good audio that isn't just me humming, what the difference is between all of those different terms. Now, the video does drop a couple of extra terms, but you can go ahead and just focus on the ones that I've used. There's a little bit more detail in the video, but not a whole heck of a lot. Just care about the ones we've already talked about. Now, if we've talked about sort of the shape and the quality and all of that about our waves of sound, now we can talk about how we are going to perceive those waves. And so we can start by talking about our hearing capacities. So what is the range of sounds that we can hear? So humans have an okay sound range. We can hear from as low as 20 hertz up to as high as 20,000 hertz. And as we get older, this upper range actually drops. So there are certain things that younger humans can hear that older humans cannot, because our hearing range decreases as we get older. But we'll swing back to that a little bit later. We also have some things to consider in terms of loudness. High amplitude sound waves are carrying a lot of energy, and that can actually damage the structures that we use to hear. So even brief exposure to very loud sound, so anything over 120 decibels, can be painful and cause long-term damage. And then, interestingly, our absolute threshold isn't the same for all frequencies of sound. We have a much lower absolute threshold for sounds in the range of human speech, which happens to be right around 2000 hertz. And I have a visual for this. So if we're going to start looking at sort of subsections of this graph, because there's tons going on here. So this axis here is just sound pressure in decibels, and that's a fancy way of saying how loud something is. So down at the bottom, very, very quiet. Up at the top is very, very loud. And they've given us some convenient examples for how quiet or how loud something is. So the very bottom is the lowest sound audible to a human ear. Our absolute threshold at our very best case scenario. We can go up to busy traffic, a chainsaw, a jet plane, and so on. Across the top here now, we can look at frequency. So this is the frequency of the sound. And so if we look at this green line, this is our threshold for hearing, which I don't know why they didn't use the terms we've already established, which would be our absolute threshold. So this green line is our absolute threshold for hearing. And what we had just pointed out on on this page here is that our lowest absolute threshold, the point that we are most sensitive to sounds, is in that 2000 hertz range, which is right here. So that's the lowest point. And like I said, that's the frequency that most human speech happens at. So we are really, really good at hearing other humans talk to us. And as we get higher frequency than that, our absolute threshold actually gets higher. So sounds need to be louder. They have to have a higher amplitude for us to hear them as they get further away from what we're optimized for. And the same with lower frequencies. a very low frequency sound would have to be very, very loud for us to be able to pick up on it. And that's just how our hearing works. And similarly at the top here, this red line is going to be a threshold for pain. So at what point is it too loud for us to stand? And we still see that the lowest point for that threshold for pain is still in the range where human communication happens. So that's where we can hear the smallest sounds or the less intense sounds. That's also where we are most likely to be damaged if we hear things that are too loud. And so there's a little bit of variation where we can tolerate more loud sounds as they are very high or very low frequency, but it's still not great for us to be exposed to things in that 120 decibel range or higher. And now our next slide, this is completely for your information, not testable. Again, I put my little notes here so that you know you don't have to memorize it. Again, I just find this really cool. And this is showing us some of the hearing capacities for humans compared to other species. So ours is the 20 to 20,000 hertz. Dogs have they can't hear as low frequency as we can. They can only hear down to about 50 hertz, but they can hear higher frequencies than we can. Cats have a similar lower frequency limit, but they can hear much higher frequencies than dogs, which I found surprising. Bats have about the same lower level as us, but can hear crazy high frequencies, which makes sense for their sonar, sonar is the right word, I think, maybe. The next cool one was dolphins, who can hear very, very low frequencies, much lower than we can, but they can also hear much, much higher frequencies. And the only explanation I can offer for this is that they're hearing sounds in water. So whereas every other species on the list is hearing sound in air, maybe the medium is affecting sort of how they're detecting these sounds. I'm not an expert on dolphin hearing. I focus on birds myself, but interesting to know. And then elephants are much, much lower frequency. So their lowest frequency is much lower than ours, but their upper frequency is lower as well. So again, just for interest's sake, because I think it's cool. Now, the next part of this chapter, we're actually going to start talking about the structures that make up the ear. So how is it that we're capable of hearing? So we can talk about our three major parts. We have the outer or external ear. That's the flap that's on the outside of your head. We have the middle ear and then the inner ear. And sound gets conducted differently in each part. So of course, we're going to break it down and look at all of these components individually. Now, as always, when I show a diagram, I remind people that I don't like to show diagrams on tests. So I'm not going to give you a picture and ask you to tell me where a certain structure is. I just want you to know, say, the order that sounds travel through different structures. If I gave you a list of structures, could you tell me which one's correctly ordered? Something like that. But on this diagram here, we have our outer ear. And this is where sounds are traveling through air. So this is our pinna, the outside flappy bit on the outside of your head, and also our ear canal. So this whole area is still open to the air right up until we get to our eardrum. And the eardrum is going to mark the transition from our outer ear into our middle ear. And then our middle ear is going to have sort of from the eardrum into this oval window with our three ossicles. And we'll have a more detailed diagram on the next slide. And then the inner ear is sort of in from there. So in the outer ear, sound is traveling through the air. In the middle ear, those sound waves, the vibrations from the air molecules, gets transferred to vibrations in this membrane and these bones. So these bones are transferring those vibrations into our skull. So the sound waves aren't traveling through air anymore, they're traveling through these solid structures. And then on the inside, in our inner ear, we move into this sort of fluidy area of the cochlea that's going to start interpreting some of our sounds. So sounds are traveling differently in all of these different structures. Now, as promised, we have a slightly zoomed in, a little bit more detailed image here. So we've kind of gotten rid of the pinea that would be on the outside here, but we still have our auditory canal. And this here is the same as right here, just to orient us. So this is called the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. Both are used. And then here we have our ossicles. I don't so much focus on the specifics. We have a malleus, an incus, and a stapes. They're all ossicles. So they're three very, very teeny tiny bones that allow sound waves to travel from this membrane to this membrane. And so this inner section here is going to be our middle ear, with the bones going between those two membranes. So now this circle here that the stapes is attached to, that's our oval window. That's the second membrane. And that's sort of where we transition from our middle ear to our inner ear. And here I'm going to point out very briefly that we have our semicircular canals. Now these are part of the ear, but aren't involved in hearing. We're going to come back to these guys a little bit later because they help us with some other bodily senses, but aren't involved in our hearing. But what we care about on the inner ear is exclusively our cochlea. And this is sort of a spiral of membranes that's going to allow us to actually detect what frequencies we're hearing. So if we were doing a walkthrough of what structures a sound wave passes through as it enters the ear, we would say that it comes through the pinea, the outer ear, into the ear canal or the auditory canal. Those sound waves in the air are going to push against this tympanic membrane. They push against our eardrum and cause the eardrum to vibrate. And the vibrations of this membrane transfer over to our ossicles. So the ossicles vibrate at the same frequency that the eardrum was vibrating at because of the vibrations in the air. And those ossicles transfer our vibrations from the tympanic membrane over to our oval window. So the vibrations enter to the oval window and through there enter into our cochlea. So that's how the sound waves get in. Now we want to look at what's called our basilar membrane within the cochlea. Now the basilar membrane is going to be a pretty stiff membrane. And so it's running here down the middle of our cochlea. So it's separating two fluid-filled canals within the cochlea. And so in this case, we're having vibrations in the fluid and in the membrane itself. Because if we hop too far back, if we hop back here, we have this oval window that's connecting into the cochlea. So the vibrations from our ossicles transfer to the oval window, so that membrane vibrates and transmits those vibrations into the fluid-filled cochlea. So it's all about vibrations with sound. And so here we can look at a couple of different things. So the basilar membrane has hair cells, and those hair cells are our receptors to pick up on sounds. So they can detect when they're vibrating or when the membrane that they're attached to is vibrating. And so here we can see that there's a wave shape in that basilar membrane. And that wave is going to change shape. It's going to curve differently depending on what frequencies you're hearing. So the different frequencies are vibrating at different rates, and they're going to produce different kinds of waves. And so the location of these peaks of waves along the basilar membrane are one way that we can pick up on frequencies of sound. Another way is we can look at, so this is the basilar membrane again, but instead of just a crosscut of it, we're looking at the curved type shape of it. So again, I can pop back and we see that it's coiled up kind of like a snail. And at the very beginning, so the closest we are to that oval window, the basilar membrane is very stiff and narrow. And so those qualities of being stiff and very narrow mean that it's going to vibrate at very high frequencies. So it would vibrate along with, say, our upper end of our hearing. So that's where we would detect high frequencies like 20,000 hertz. And as we get further along this membrane, it's going to get wider and less stiff. So it's going to get more flexible. And so the further along you go, the more it's going to vibrate along with lower and lower frequencies. So we can go from our upper limit of 20,000 hertz all the way to the inside of our lower limit of 20 hertz. And this setup is why we think that we have hearing loss in those upper ranges as we get older. Because throughout all of our lives, the early part of this basilar membrane is the first thing that's exposed to sound waves. So it's going to be degraded and worn down over time. So our ability to tell or to pick up on those frequencies gets worse over time. Now, I've focused very heavily here on pitch perception. So I haven't really mentioned anything beyond what frequency that we're picking up on or what frequency the membrane vibrates at, and that's for good reason. Our understanding of how we perceive loudness and quality of sound is terrible. We still don't have a fantastic theory on how it works, and the theories that we do have are fairly complicated and hard to grasp. So a lot of times when we look at hearing, we focus almost exclusively on pitch perception, and this class is no exception to that. So we're going to talk about two theories of pitch perception, and then we're going to call it good for hearing. So our two theories are place theory and frequency theory. And we've already kind of laid the groundwork for this just in how we've been talking about the structures. So for place theory, we're saying that pitch perception corresponds to the vibration of different portions or different places along the basilar membrane. So we are saying that, actually this image is a little bit better. So if the membrane is vibrating at this point, then we are perceiving a very high-pitched sound. If it's vibrating here, we're perceiving a much lower-pitched sound. So the location, the distance along the basilar membrane that's vibrating, is responsible for our perception of what pitch it is that we're hearing. Now, our next theory is similar but a little bit different, and this is frequency theory. So it doesn't so much care about the place, but it's saying that our perception of pitch corresponds to the rate or the frequency at which the whole membrane is vibrating. So how quickly is that membrane vibrating? The idea of cycles per second comes back to mind. So if the whole membrane is vibrating very, very quickly, then we're probably hearing higher pitch sounds. And of course, that brings us to the idea, okay, well, which one is it? Are we using pitch perception with place theory or with frequency theory? And the answer is actually both. So we use a little bit of both. So lower frequency tones seem to be using frequency coding. So they low frequency, lower pitch tones will vibrate the whole membrane at a much slower rate. And that seems to be what we're attending to. Higher frequency tones seem to rely on place coding. So what location along the whole membrane is vibrating the most? So what specific place vibrates along with that sound? And again, you'll notice that this only holds for tones, the ones that have the cleanest sound envelopes, that are most pure. Because, yet again, our understanding of how sound happens, how we perceive it, is still not fantastic. Once we run into complex tones, it's a little bit of place theory, it's a little bit of frequency theory, it's a little bit of both, and it's sometimes neither. So as we get further away from pure tones, it gets complicated and messy. So we're keeping to our idyllic idea of sort of low frequency, pure tones are frequency coding, and high frequency pure tones are place coding, and we will leave it there. Now we can talk about some of our uses of sound. And this is something that we've all experienced, that we all probably understand, but haven't necessarily put a name to. And so this is auditory localization, which is our ability to locate the source of a sound in a space. So if you've ever been at a party and a friend calls your name across the room, and you know instinctively which direction to look to see your friend. And this is actually because of some complex stuff going on with how our ears are located and how our brains pick up on the sounds. So the fact that we have two ears, one on either side of our head, gives us some ability to localize. So was that sound closer to my left ear or to my right ear? And the idea being that if your left ear heard it louder or heard it sooner, then that person is probably closer to that ear. So you would know to look in that direction. So we can rely on intensity or loudness as well as timing. And so you can have a diagram like this where you're seeing that there's a slightly shorter distance to reach this ear and a slightly longer distance to reach this ear. And it's going to get here and be a little bit louder and a little bit faster. And our brains can interpret that difference in loudness and timing to give us an idea of where to look. And then we can move on to talk about the inability to hear. And so deafness is fairly common. 1 in 1,000 people is deaf. And a lot of others aren't completely deaf, but will have hearing deficits. So there's lots of ways that you can have problems with hearing. And there's, like I said, lots of causes. Some are going to be genetic. Some are going to come from diseases or injury or exposure to loud noise. People can be born deaf or become deaf over time. There's lots and lots of ways it can happen. And so 2 of the major types of deafness that the textbook talks about are conductive deafness and nerve deafness. So nerve deafness is that you have a problem with the hair cells that are lining your basilar membrane. So those are our sensory receptors. So there's either a problem with the hair cells that are attaching to the neurons that will then send those signals to your brain. Those are sensory neurons. Or you can have problems with the nerves themselves. And that's called nerve deafness because there's a problem in that circuitry. The other type of deafness is conductive deafness. And this happens when there's something wrong with getting the sound, getting those vibrations actually to the basilar membrane. So this is fairly common if, say, you suffered a blow to the head and your ossicles got knocked out of place. If those bones don't connect the eardrum to the oval window, then you can't conduct sound from outside your head to inside your head, which is why it's called conductive deafness. And of course, noise-induced hearing loss is also a big problem, especially in society today. And sometimes you'll have people who get noise-induced hearing loss that isn't just an absence of sound, but it can come across with tinnitus, which is a ringing in your ears. And we've already talked about age-related hearing loss, which is that it's fairly normal for us to lose some hearing as we get older. And then our last slide, super quick at the very end here, is effects of music. So if we're getting into behaviors and effects of music, music seems to have a pretty large effect on how our brains form. So if you looked at CT scans or brains of people who are musicians versus non-musicians, you have very visible differences. So musicians have larger motor, auditory, and visuospatial areas of the cerebellum than non-musicians. So they've exercised and grown the part of their brain that they use to make music. And there seems to be some links between ability to play music and language learning abilities. There's some crossover in the parts of the brain that help us do language as well as play music. And there's some evidence for music enhancing our spatial abilities. So listening to calming music like Mozart can help us perform better on spatial tasks. But very cool research if you have time to look into it. But we have to leave it there, and we will talk next time about our sense of taste.